The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. Catherine was deep in sleep when William's trembling hand reached across their bed at Adelaide Cottage. His father's private secretary was on the line, and the words that followed would change their lives forever. King Charles III had suffered a massive heart attack. The doctors were fighting to save him, but the unthinkable was happening. In the space of a single heartbeat, William Arthur Philip Louis was about to become King of England, and Catherine Elizabeth Middleton would become Queen Consort. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for what the world would witness in the coming hours. The autumn wind rattled the windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine stirred from her sleep. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the way William's breathing had changed beside her. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed an eerie green in the darkness. 3:47 a.m. That's when the phone rang. William bolted upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the secure line that connected them to Buckingham Palace. Catherine watched his face drain of color as he listened to the voice on the other end. She didn't need to hear the words to know that their world was about to collapse. "Yes, I understand," William whispered into the receiver, his voice barely audible. "We'll be there immediately." As he hung up, Catherine saw something in her husband's eyes that she had never seen before. Pure, undiluted fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from facing a difficult situation, but the terror of a man who had just been told his father was dying and that he was about to inherit the most powerful throne in the world. "Charles?" Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. William nodded, unable to speak. King Charles III had collapsed in his private study at Clarence House just after midnight. The royal physicians were fighting to stabilize him, but the early reports were devastating. A massive coronary event had left the 74-year-old monarch clinging to life, and the constitutional machinery of succession was already grinding into motion. Catherine reached for William's hand, feeling it tremble in hers. They had always known this day would come, but not like this. Not when they were still settling into their roles as the Prince and Princess of Wales. Not when their children were so young. Not when the world seemed more fractured and uncertain than ever before. The drive to Clarence House was a blur of flashing lights and police escorts. Catherine sat beside William in the back of their Range Rover, watching London's empty streets streak past the bulletproof windows. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? In the span of a few hours, they had gone from being senior working royals to potentially becoming the King and Queen of the United Kingdom and 15 other Commonwealth realms. When they arrived at Clarence House, the scene was controlled chaos. Royal physicians moved urgently between rooms while private secretaries spoke in hushed tones into secure phones. Queen Camilla sat in the drawing room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when Catherine and William entered, and for a moment, the weight of what was happening hung heavy in the air. "He's stable for now," Camilla said quietly. "But the doctors aren't optimistic." William walked to the window overlooking the gardens where he had played as a child. Catherine could see his shoulders shaking slightly, and she knew he was fighting back tears. This was the man who had lost his mother at 12 years old, who had carried the burden of being second in line to the throne his entire adult life, and who was now facing the possibility of losing his father just as he was beginning to understand him as both a parent and a king. The hours that followed were a masterclass in constitutional crisis management. The private secretary to the sovereign, Sir Clive Alderton, had already begun implementing the protocols established for the transition of power. Operation London Bridge, the codename for procedures following the death of Elizabeth II, had been activated and adapted for this unprecedented situation. But this wasn't a peaceful transition following a long reign. This was sudden, shocking, and the entire royal household was scrambling to keep up. By 6 in the morning, it became clear that King Charles would not be returning to his duties anytime soon, even if he survived. The damage to his heart was extensive, and the physicians were recommending immediate surgery followed by a lengthy recovery period. The constitutional lawyers were already drafting the papers that would allow William to serve as regent, effectively becoming king in all but name. Catherine found herself thrust into conversations she had never imagined having. Palace officials briefed her on security protocols, media strategies, and the delicate balance of maintaining public confidence while preparing for the worst. She listened intently, but part of her mind kept drifting to their children, asleep in their beds at Adelaide Cottage, unaware that their father might wake up as king. The first crisis came at dawn. News of the king's hospitalization had leaked to the press, and within minutes, reporters and photographers were gathering outside every royal residence. The palace had to make a decision: continue with the planned silence until there was definitive news, or get ahead of the story with a carefully crafted statement. William made the call. Against the advice of some senior officials, he insisted on transparency. "The people have a right to know," he told the assembled team. "We can't let speculation run wild while my father fights for his life." The statement, released at 7:30 a.m., was brief but shocking. His Majesty the King was taken ill during the early hours of this morning and has been hospitalized for emergency treatment. The Prince of Wales has been informed and is with His Majesty. Further updates will be provided as appropriate. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, news outlets around the world were breaking into their regular programming. Social media exploded with messages of support, speculation, and concern. The pound sterling began fluctuating wildly on international markets. Commonwealth prime ministers started making emergency calls to Downing Street. The machine of modern monarchy, with all its constitutional implications and global reach, had been set into motion. Catherine watched the news coverage from a small sitting room in Clarence House, feeling utterly surreal about seeing her own life become the lead story on every major network. The images of her and William arriving earlier that morning were being analyzed by royal commentators who speculated about everything from her choice of clothing to the expression on William's face. But it was the crowd gathering outside Buckingham Palace that truly drove home the magnitude of what they were facing. Even in the early morning hours, hundreds of people had begun to collect, some laying flowers, others simply standing in silent vigil. These were people who had lived through the death of Queen Elizabeth II, who understood the profound significance of royal transitions, and who were now watching history unfold in real time. The constitutional implications were staggering. If Charles died or remained incapacitated, William would become king immediately. There would be no time for preparation, no gradual transition of responsibilities. The Accession Council would meet within hours to formally proclaim him King William V. Foreign heads of state would need to be notified. The Commonwealth realms would need to acknowledge the new sovereign. And, through it all, the British people would be watching, judging, hoping that their new king and queen were ready for the immense responsibility being thrust upon them. By mid-morning, it became clear that Charles would survive, but his reign would never be the same. The surgery had been successful in restoring blood flow to his heart, but the damage was extensive. Even in the best-case scenario, he would need months of recovery and would likely never be able to resume his full royal duties. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult in the long history of the British monarchy. Charles, barely conscious but determined to make his wishes known, asked to speak with William privately. Catherine waited outside the hospital room, listening to the muffled voices of father and son discussing the future of the crown. When William emerged 20 minutes later, his face told the story. Charles had made his decision. Rather than cling to a throne he could no longer adequately serve, he would abdicate in favor of his son. It was a decision that would require parliamentary approval, constitutional review, and careful coordination with the Commonwealth realms. But Charles was adamant. The monarchy needed strong leadership, and he could no longer provide it. The news of the impending abdication would not be made public for several days, giving the royal household time to prepare for the transition. But Catherine could see in William's eyes that he was already processing what it meant. In a matter of weeks, possibly sooner, he would be king, and she would be queen. As they returned to Adelaide Cottage that evening, Catherine looked at her husband, soon to be her king, and realized that nothing in their lives had prepared them for what was coming. They had been trained for royal duty, groomed for public service, and educated in the constitutional role of the monarchy. But no amount of preparation could ready someone for the moment when theory becomes reality, when the abstract concept of kingship becomes a living, breathing responsibility that weighs on your shoulders every moment of every day. The children were waiting for them, full of questions about why Grandpa Charles was in the hospital and why there were so many people with cameras outside their house. Catherine and William sat them down in the kitchen, choosing their words carefully as they explained that Grandpa was very sick and that their family's life was about to change in ways they were only beginning to understand. That night, as Catherine lay beside William in their bed, she could hear him whispering prayers into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new scrutiny. But tonight, they were still just William and Catherine, a husband and wife facing the unknown together, holding on to each other as their world transformed around them. Neither of them slept much that night. How could they? In less than 24 hours, they had gone from being the future king and queen to becoming the present reality of the British monarchy. The weight of 1,000 years of history was settling on their shoulders, and they were about to discover whether they were strong enough to carry it. The emergency meeting of the Privy Council was called for noon, just 18 hours after King Charles had collapsed. Catherine found herself in the unprecedented position of sitting beside William as constitutional lawyers, government ministers, and senior royals gathered in the ornate council chamber at Buckingham Palace to discuss something that had never happened in modern British history: the voluntary abdication of a reigning monarch due to incapacity. Lord President of the Council Penny Mordaunt opened the session with a gravity that filled the room. The constitutional implications of Charles's decision to abdicate were staggering. Unlike the abdication crisis of 1936, this wasn't about personal choice or scandal. This was about a king who genuinely could no longer fulfill his duties and was making the painful decision to step aside for the good of the realm. William sat rigidly in his chair, his face a mask of composure that Catherine knew was barely containing the turmoil beneath. She could see the slight tremor in his hands as he reviewed the documents that would transform him from heir to sovereign. The weight of what they were discussing seemed to press down on everyone in the room like a physical force. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, spoke first about the religious implications. The coronation oath that Charles had taken less than 18 months earlier bound him to serve until death. The theological and constitutional questions surrounding abdication were complex, requiring careful consideration of both canon law and parliamentary statute. "Your Royal Highness," Archbishop Welby addressed William directly, "the Church stands ready to support whatever decision is made for the good of the nation and the Commonwealth. However, we must be certain that this transition maintains the sacred nature of the monarch's role as supreme governor of the Church of England." Catherine watched William nod solemnly, though she knew he was struggling with doubts that went far beyond constitutional law. The previous night, he had confessed to her his fear that he wasn't ready, that he needed more time to prepare for the enormity of being king. But time was a luxury they no longer had. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak joined the meeting by secure video link from Downing Street, where he was managing the political fallout from the morning's news. The markets were in turmoil, Commonwealth prime ministers were demanding immediate consultations, and Parliament was being recalled from recess to address the constitutional crisis. "Your Royal Highness," Sunak addressed William, "the government stands ready to support the transition in whatever way necessary. However, we must move quickly to restore stability and confidence. The longer this uncertainty continues, the more difficult it becomes to manage the broader implications." Catherine found herself taking notes, something that felt surreal given the magnitude of what they were discussing. She was writing down details about coronation planning, parliamentary procedures, and media strategies for her husband's ascension to the throne. Just 2 days ago, she had been planning their children's half-term activities. Now she was helping to orchestrate one of the most significant constitutional events in British history. The legal complexities were mind-boggling. Sir Stephen Laws, the former First Parliamentary Council, had been called in to advise on the technical aspects of abdication. Unlike other European monarchies that had established procedures for royal abdication, Britain had no modern legal framework for a sovereign to voluntarily relinquish the crown. The Abdication Act of 1936 created a precedent, Sir Stephen explained. But the circumstances were entirely different. King Edward VIII abdicated to Mary Wallace Simpson, a personal choice that created a constitutional crisis. His Majesty's situation is one of genuine incapacity, which raises different legal and moral questions. Catherine listened intently as the lawyers outlined the process. Parliament would need to pass new legislation specifically allowing Charles to abdicate while maintaining the legitimacy of the succession. The Commonwealth realms would need to enact parallel legislation. The timing would need to be coordinated to ensure there was no gap in royal authority that could create legal or constitutional problems. The most immediate concern was the Regency Act. Sir Clive Alderton explained that they could implement a regency arrangement temporarily, allowing William to perform royal duties while Charles remained technically king. But Charles had been adamant that he wanted a clean transition, believing that the monarchy needed clear, unambiguous leadership. His Majesty was quite specific, Sir Clive reported. He believes that a regency would create confusion and undermine confidence in the institution. He wants to abdicate formally and completely, allowing the Prince of Wales to become king in his own right. Catherine caught William's eye across the table and saw a flicker of panic. The reality of what they were discussing was hitting him in waves. This wasn't a theoretical conversation about future responsibilities. This was immediate, urgent, and irreversible. Once Charles signed the abdication papers, William would be King William V, and their lives would be forever changed. The discussion turned to the practical arrangements. The coronation would need to be planned on an accelerated timeline. Traditionally, new monarchs waited months or even years after accession before being crowned. But, given the circumstances, there was pressure for a swift coronation to demonstrate stability and continuity. Dame Elizabeth Anson, the royal events coordinator, outlined the challenges. Westminster Abbey needed to be prepared, guest lists compiled, security arranged, and protocols established for what would be the first coronation in the social media age following an abdication rather than a death. The logistics were staggering. "Your Royal Highness," Dame Elizabeth addressed Catherine directly, "we will need to begin fittings for the coronation robes immediately. The Queen Consort's crown will need to be adjusted, and we must coordinate with the crown jeweler for all the regalia preparations." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. They were talking about her crown, her coronation, her transformation from Catherine, Princess of Wales, to Catherine, Queen of England. The titles that had once seemed like distant possibilities were becoming immediate realities. The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from the hospital. Charles had taken a turn for the worse, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low. The medical team was rushing him back into surgery, and the prognosis was uncertain. Suddenly, the theoretical discussions about abdication became moot. They might be dealing with a succession due to death rather than choice. William excused himself from the meeting, and Catherine followed him into a private anteroom. For the first time since the crisis began, she saw her husband break down. The man who had carried himself with such dignity through his mother's death, through military service, through years of public scrutiny, was sobbing like the frightened son he had never been allowed to be. "I can't do this without him," William whispered, his voice breaking. "I need more time. I need him to teach me how to be king." Catherine held him close, feeling her own tears mixing with his. She thought about their children, about the life they had built together, about the future they had imagined. All of it was changing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "We'll figure it out together," she whispered back. "Whatever happens, we face it together." When they returned to the council chamber, the mood had shifted. News of Charles's medical emergency had reached the assembled officials, and the urgent reality of potential succession was palpable. Constitutional lawyer after constitutional lawyer spoke about the immediate transfer of power, the automatic nature of royal succession, and the procedures that would need to be followed if Charles died while they were still meeting. Archbishop Welby spoke about the religious implications of sudden succession versus planned abdication. The coronation oath, the anointing ceremony, the sacred nature of kingship, all of it took on new urgency if William was about to become king through inheritance rather than abdication. Catherine found herself thrust into conversations about her own role. As queen consort, she would have constitutional responsibilities, ceremonial duties, and a level of public scrutiny that she was only beginning to understand. Royal historians briefed her on the precedents set by previous queens consort, from Queen Mary to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother to Queen Camilla. The most challenging aspect was the immediate nature of everything. There would be no gradual transition, no time to ease into the role. If Charles died, William would become king the moment of his father's death, and Catherine would become queen consort simultaneously. The accession council would meet within hours, foreign ambassadors would be summoned, and the world would be watching their every move. Lord Chamberlain Andrew Parker outlined the immediate protocols. If Charles died, William would need to make a declaration to the accession council within 24 hours. The coronation would be scheduled for approximately 6 months later, giving time for mourning and preparation. The Commonwealth realms would need to be notified immediately, and there would be a complex series of ceremonial and constitutional requirements to fulfill. Catherine listened to the discussions about her own ceremonial role, the expectations placed on a queen consort, and the delicate balance between supporting the king while maintaining her own public profile. It was overwhelming and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The call from the hospital came at 3:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the first call had awakened them. Charles had survived the second surgery, but barely. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his immediate survival, but they were unanimous in their assessment. He would never be able to resume his royal duties. The decision about abdication was no longer theoretical, it was medical necessity. When William returned from speaking privately with his father's physicians, his face had changed. The panic and fear were still there, but underneath them was something new: acceptance. Not the willing acceptance of someone eager for power, but the reluctant acceptance of someone who understood that duty sometimes demands more than we think we can give. "My father is determined to abdicate," William announced to the assembled council. "The medical evidence supports his decision. We need to begin the formal procedures immediately." The rest of the afternoon was a blur of legal documents, constitutional procedures, and urgent planning. Parliament would be recalled within 48 hours to begin consideration of the abdication legislation. The Commonwealth prime ministers would be briefed that evening. The media strategy would focus on stability, continuity, and the strength of the constitutional system. Catherine found herself assigned a private secretary, a protocol officer, and a team of advisors who would help her navigate her new role. The woman who had been planning her children's school activities 2 days earlier was now receiving briefings on state dinner protocols, constitutional law, and the intricate details of royal precedents. As the meeting finally concluded, Catherine and William walked together through the corridors of Buckingham Palace that would soon be their primary residence. The portraits of previous monarchs looked down at them, their painted eyes seeming to judge whether this young couple was ready for the enormous responsibility being thrust upon them. That evening, they returned to Adelaide Cottage for what they knew might be their last night as the Prince and Princess of Wales. The children were asleep, unaware that their lives were about to be transformed as dramatically as their parents. Catherine and William sat in their kitchen, drinking tea and trying to process the magnitude of what the next few weeks would bring. "Are we ready for this?" William asked, his voice quiet in the domestic stillness of their home. Catherine reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Nobody could be ready for this. But we'll learn together, and we'll do our best to serve with dignity and honor." Outside their kitchen window, they could see the security teams that had been doubled since the morning. The normal life they had built together was already beginning to slip away, replaced by the formal requirements and constant scrutiny that came with the crown. But in that moment, they were still just William and Catherine, husband and wife, facing an uncertain future together with nothing but love and determination to guide them. The abdication papers were signed at 10:30 a.m. on a gray October morning, witnessed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and the Lord Chancellor. Catherine stood beside William in the private study at Clarence House, watching as King Charles III formally relinquished the crown he had waited 70 years to inherit and held for barely 18 months. Charles's hand shook as he signed the document that would make his eldest son King William V. The medical equipment monitoring his heart created a steady rhythm in the background, a mechanical reminder of the frailty that had forced this unprecedented moment. When he finished writing his name for the last time as king, Charles looked up at William with eyes that held both profound sadness and unmistakable relief. "The crown is yours now, my son," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible. "May you wear it with wisdom and grace." The moment the final signature was complete, everything changed. William was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was His Majesty King William V, by the grace of God, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of his other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. And Catherine, who had been nervously adjusting her black dress throughout the ceremony, was now Her Majesty Queen Catherine, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The transformation was instantaneous and surreal. Palace officials who had been addressing them as Your Royal Highness just minutes before were now bowing and using Your Majesty. The subtle but significant change in protocol marked a shift in their lives that felt almost impossible to comprehend. Sir Clive Alderton approached the new king with the first decision that would require his immediate attention. The Accession Council was scheduled to meet at St. James's Palace in 3 hours, where William would make his formal declaration as king. The wording of that declaration would set the tone for his entire reign, and every word would be analyzed and remembered for decades to come. Catherine watched her husband, her king, as he reviewed the draft declaration. His hands were steady now, his voice calm as he discussed minor revisions with the private secretaries. Something fundamental had shifted in those few moments between being heir and being sovereign. The weight of responsibility that had terrified him just days before was now settling into place, and she could see him beginning to accept it. The drive to St. James's Palace was unlike anything they had experienced before. The motorcycle escort was larger, the security more intense, and The crowds lining the streets were massive despite the short notice. People held signs reading, "God Save the King," and "Long Live Queen Catherine." But there were also faces in the crowd that showed uncertainty, concern about the unprecedented nature of this transition. Catherine sat beside William in the Bentley state limousine, acutely aware that this was their first public appearance as king and queen. Every gesture would be photographed, every expression analyzed, every detail scrutinized by millions of people around the world. She had chosen a navy blue coat dress with a small diamond brooch, appropriately somber for the circumstances, while still projecting stability and confidence. The accession council itself was a ceremony steeped in centuries of tradition. Over 200 privy councillors had assembled in the Atre room of St. James's Palace, including former prime ministers, senior politicians, judges, and religious leaders. Catherine took her place in the gallery reserved for family members, watching as William prepared to make the declaration that would formally begin his reign. Lord President Penny Mordaunt opened the proceedings with the traditional proclamation, "Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign Lord King Charles III of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Prince William Arthur Philip Louis." The formal language of succession, unchanged for centuries, felt strange when applied to a living former king who was recovering in a hospital room just miles away. But constitutional law required this fiction. Charles was legally dead to the crown the moment he abdicated, and William's succession was as automatic and complete as if his father had actually died. When William stood to make his declaration, the room fell into complete silence. Catherine could see the slight tension in his shoulders, but his voice was strong and clear as he spoke the words that would define his kingship. "Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, being here assisted with those of her late Majesty's Privy Council, with numbers of other principal gentlemen of quality, with the Lord Mayor, aldermen, and citizens of London, do now hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Prince William Arthur Philip Louis is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege Lord William V, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with all hearty and humble affection, beseeching God by whom kings and queens do reign to bless his majesty with long and prosperous years to reign over us." But it was William's personal addition to the traditional text that would be remembered as the defining moment of his accession. After completing the formal declaration, he paused and added words that no newly proclaimed monarch had ever spoken. "I accept this sacred trust not through inheritance alone, but through the loving sacrifice of my father, His Majesty King Charles III, whose wisdom and dedication to duty have prepared me for this moment. I pledge to serve with humility, compassion, and unwavering commitment to the people of our United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. Together with my beloved wife Catherine, now your queen, we shall endeavor to honor the legacy of those who came before us while meeting the challenges of our time with courage and unity." The addition was unprecedented, deeply personal, and politically significant. William was acknowledging both the unusual circumstances of his accession and his father's continued living presence, while also emphasizing his partnership with Catherine in a way that elevated her role beyond the traditional position of queen consort. Catherine felt tears welling in her eyes as she listened to her husband claim his throne. This was the man she had fallen in love with at university, the father of her children, her partner in everything they had built together. Now he was king, and she was queen, and their private life had become public property in ways they were only beginning to understand. The formal proclamation was followed by the first state council meeting of the new reign. William took his place at the head of the table where monarchs had presided for centuries, with Catherine seated to his right in a position that emphasized her constitutional role as queen consort. The business was largely ceremonial, approving various orders and appointments, but every decision was now made in the name of King William V. The Prime Minister briefed the new king on the most urgent matters requiring royal attention. Parliament needed to be formally opened for the special session that would ratify the abdication legislation. Commonwealth prime ministers were requesting immediate audiences to reaffirm their realm's loyalty to the new monarch. Foreign ambassadors wanted to present their credentials to King William rather than the incapacitated King Charles. Catherine found herself thrust into immediate responsibilities as well. As queen consort, she would need to begin accepting patronages, planning her first solo engagements, and establishing her own household staff. The Queen's private secretary, Dame Mary Morrison, briefed her on the dozens of charitable organizations seeking royal patronage and the delicate process of choosing which causes to support. The most challenging aspect was the media attention. Within hours of the accession ceremony, photographs of Catherine's every expression during the proceedings were being analyzed on television and social media. Royal commentators debated the significance of her choice to wear her grandmother's pearl earrings, the meaning of her composed demeanor, and speculation about how she would define her role as queen. The evening brought their first state dinner as king and queen, a hastily arranged affair for the Commonwealth High Commissioners who had flown to London for the transition. Catherine wore Queen Mary's diamond Riviere tiara for the first time, feeling the weight of both the jewels and the history they represented. The tiara had been worn by 4 previous queens, and now it was hers. Walking into the state dining room at Buckingham Palace, Catherine was struck by the surreal nature of the evening. Just 1 week ago, she had been planning her children's half-term schedule. Now she was hosting heads of government and making small talk about constitutional law and Commonwealth relations while wearing a tiara worth millions of pounds. William handled the formal aspects of the dinner with remarkable composure, but Catherine could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The weight of the crown was already taking its toll, and they were only hours into his reign. During the receiving line, she watched him greet each High Commissioner with appropriate dignity, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. The Canadian High Commissioner raised concerns about the speed of the transition and the need for parliamentary approval of the abdication in each Commonwealth realm. The Australian representative questioned whether the unusual circumstances might provide an opportunity for Republican movements to challenge the monarchy's legitimacy. The New Zealand High Commissioner was more supportive, but emphasized the need for clear communication about the King's intentions and vision for the future. Catherine found herself in conversations about her own role that were both fascinating and overwhelming. The South African High Commissioner asked about her plans for Commonwealth youth engagement. The Jamaican representative inquired about her interest in environmental issues. Each conversation was a delicate dance of diplomacy, personal interest, and constitutional propriety. The most poignant moment of the evening came when the Barbados High Commissioner approached Catherine privately during the reception. Barbados had become a republic just 3 years earlier, removing Queen Elizabeth II as head of state, and there had been speculation about whether other Caribbean nations might follow suit. "Your Majesty," the High Commissioner said quietly, "there is hope in Bridgetown that your generation might bring a different approach to Commonwealth relations. The wounds of history are deep, but perhaps new leadership can help us heal together." Catherine was struck by the complexity of what the woman was saying. As queen, she would inherit not just the privileges and pageantry of monarchy, but also the historical baggage and ongoing challenges of Britain's colonial past. Her role would involve navigating these sensitive relationships while helping to define what the Commonwealth could become in the 21st century. After the dinner, Catherine and William returned to their private apartments for the first time as king and queen. The rooms that had been redecorated for them months earlier now felt different, charged with the weight of their new roles. They sat together on the sofa in their sitting room, still wearing their formal evening attire, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked, studying her husband's face in the soft lamplight. William was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Different," he finally said. "It sounds strange, but I can feel the weight of it. Not just the responsibility, but something deeper. Like everything I do from now on matters in a way it never did before." Catherine understood what he meant. She had felt it too during the dinner, the sense that her every word and gesture carried implications beyond the immediate conversation. As queen consort, she would need to be constantly aware of the symbolic weight of her presence, the way her choices and comments would be interpreted as representing not just herself, but the monarchy as an institution. They spent the rest of the evening going through the briefing papers that would prepare them for their first full day as king and queen. There were meetings with constitutional lawyers, audiences with foreign ambassadors, and the beginning of serious planning for the coronation that would take place in 6 months. The coronation planning was particularly daunting. Westminster Abbey needed to be prepared for a ceremony that would be watched by billions of people worldwide. Every detail, from the music to the guest list to the precise choreography of the ancient rituals, required careful consideration and approval by the new king. Catherine reviewed the preliminary plans for her own role in the ceremony. As queen consort, she would have her own coronation alongside William's, complete with the anointing ceremony and the placement of the queen consort's crown on her head. The thought of that moment, kneeling before the Archbishop of Canterbury while the weight of royal history settled on her shoulders, was both thrilling and terrifying. As they finally prepared for bed, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by what she saw. She looked the same as she had that morning. Same face, same hair, same person she had always been. But something fundamental had changed. She was no longer Catherine Middleton, or even Catherine, Princess of Wales. She was Queen Catherine, and that transformation would shape every day of the rest of her life. William was already asleep when she slipped into bed beside him, exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of their first day as sovereigns. Catherine lay awake for a long time, listening to her husband's steady breathing and thinking about their children, asleep in their own beds, unaware that they had gone to sleep as the children of a prince and awakened as the children of a king. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new scrutiny. But tonight, they were still just William and Catherine, holding each other close as they faced an uncertain future together, bound by love and duty in equal measure. The first state visit of King William V's reign came just 3 weeks after his accession, when President Emmanuel Macron of France arrived for a hastily rearranged visit that had originally been planned for King Charles. Catherine stood beside William on the dais at Horse Guards Parade, watching the elaborate ceremony of the Guard of Honor while trying to process the surreal reality that this pomp and circumstance was now for them. The French president's visit was more than diplomatic courtesy. It was the first major test of how the international community would receive the new king and queen. The abdication had created uncertainty about Britain's stability and leadership, and foreign governments were carefully assessing whether William and Catherine could provide the steady, reliable partnership that had characterized Elizabeth II's 70-year reign. Catherine wore a burgundy coat dress with a matching hat, chosen specifically to complement the French tricolor without appearing to favor any particular nation's colors. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully planned by her new stylist and protocol team, but she still felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The ceremonial aspects of the state visit proceeded flawlessly, but Catherine could see the strain on William's face during the private meetings with President Macron. The French leader was diplomatic but direct in his assessment of the transition, expressing subtle concerns about constitutional stability and the implications for European relations during a period of global uncertainty. Your Majesty, Macron said during their private audience, France values the continuity of our relationship with Britain, but we hope the new reign will bring clarity about your government's intentions regarding European cooperation and trade relations. William handled the diplomatic pressure with impressive composure, but Catherine could see how each conversation added to the weight he was carrying. Every foreign leader wanted reassurance that the young king could provide the steady leadership that Britain needed during challenging times. The unspoken question underlying every diplomatic exchange was whether a 41-year-old king who had inherited the throne through abdication rather than death could command the same respect as his predecessors. The state banquet that evening was Catherine's first major test as queen consort. She wore the George IV state diadem, the same tiara worn by Queen Elizabeth II on stamps and banknotes, feeling the weight of both the jewels and the symbolism they carried. The 170 guests included French dignitaries, British politicians, and Commonwealth representatives, all watching carefully to see how the new queen would handle her role. During the dinner, Catherine found herself in conversation with Brigitte Macron about education policy and children's mental health, topics that had been her focus as Princess of Wales but now carried additional weight as queen. Every opinion she expressed would be interpreted as potentially reflecting government policy, requiring her to navigate the delicate balance between personal conviction and constitutional neutrality. The most challenging moment came during the traditional exchange of gifts. President Macron presented King William with an antique French clock that had belonged to Napoleon, while William gave the president a set of rare books about Anglo-French relations. But it was Catherine's gift to Brigitte Macron, a brooch that had belonged to Queen Victoria, that generated the most attention. The choice of Queen Victoria's brooch was laden with historical significance. Victoria had embodied British strength and imperial confidence during the height of the empire, but she had also navigated complex European relationships and family connections that spanned the continent. By choosing that particular piece, Catherine was making a subtle statement about her understanding of her role as queen consort in maintaining international relationships. After the French delegation departed, Catherine and William faced their first major domestic crisis. The Chancellor of the Exchequer had requested an urgent audience to discuss economic concerns stemming from the royal transition. International markets remained unsettled, the pound was fluctuating unpredictably, and there were questions about the costs associated with both the abdication and the upcoming coronation. The meeting took place in the private study that had once been Queen Elizabeth II's domain, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had guided the nation through various crises. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was direct in his assessment. The monarchy needed to project stability and confidence to restore market faith in British institutions. Your Majesty, Hunt explained, the markets are watching every decision you make, every public appearance, every signal about the future of the monarchy. We need to demonstrate that this transition has made the institution stronger, not weaker. Catherine listened intently as they discussed the economic implications of royal decisions she had never considered before. The cost of the coronation, the renovations to royal residences, even the choice of charitable patronages could all affect public perception and, by extension, economic confidence. The conversation highlighted the impossible balancing act that William and Catherine now faced. They needed to honor royal traditions and maintain the dignity of the crown, but they also had to demonstrate that they understood modern Britain's economic realities and social concerns. Every choice they made would be scrutinized for its symbolic meaning and practical implications. Their first joint engagement outside London took them to Yorkshire, where they visited a food bank that had seen demand increase dramatically due to the cost of living crisis. Catherine had chosen to focus her early initiatives as queen on issues of poverty and social inequality, using her platform to highlight problems that many royal watchers felt previous generations of royals had avoided addressing directly. The visit to the food bank was both powerful and controversial. Catherine spent time talking with families who were struggling to afford basic necessities, listening to their stories with genuine empathy and concern. But critics questioned whether it was appropriate for the Queen to involve herself in political issues, even through charitable work that seemed nonpartisan. Your Majesty, said Sarah Thompson, a single mother of 3 who was collecting food for her family. It means everything that you're here. Nobody expects the Queen to fix everything, but knowing that you see what we're going through makes a difference. Catherine was deeply moved by the encounter, but she was also acutely aware of the photographers capturing every moment. The images of the Queen talking with families in a food bank would be analyzed and debated for their political implications, even though her intention was purely humanitarian. The most significant challenge of their early reign came when the Scottish Parliament passed a non-binding resolution calling for a referendum on independence. The motion cited the unusual circumstances of King William's accession as evidence that the United Kingdom's constitutional arrangements were unstable and needed fundamental review. The Scottish crisis required delicate handling. As constitutional monarch, William could not take sides in political debates, but the unity of the United Kingdom was fundamental to the Crown's role. Catherine found herself studying constitutional law and Scottish history, preparing for what could become the most serious challenge to royal authority since the abdication crisis of 1936. First Minister Humza Yousaf requested a private audience with the king, ostensibly to discuss routine matters, but clearly intending to assess the new monarch's position on Scottish independence. The meeting took place at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, with Catherine accompanying William to demonstrate the Crown's commitment to Scotland. The conversation was carefully choreographed diplomatic theater. Yousaf was respectful but firm in pressing the case for Scottish self-determination, while William maintained constitutional propriety by avoiding any comments that could be interpreted as political intervention. Catherine observed the delicate dance, understanding that every word would be analyzed for hidden meanings. Your Majesty, Yousaf said carefully, Scotland has always valued its relationship with the Crown, but the people of Scotland must be allowed to determine their own constitutional future. We hope the new reign will respect democratic principles and the will of the Scottish people. William's response was masterful in its constitutional correctness, Scotland's place in our United Kingdom is valued beyond measure. The Crown serves all our people, and we trust in the wisdom of democratic institutions and processes to address the concerns and aspirations of every part of our realm. The exchange was polite, formal, and completely non-committal, but Catherine could see the strain it placed on William. The king's role required him to remain above politics while potentially watching the dissolution of the United Kingdom he had sworn to serve. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, especially for a monarch who had inherited the throne during a period of constitutional uncertainty. The media coverage of their Scottish visit was intense and polarized. Independence supporters criticized the royal couple for representing an outdated colonial relationship, while Unionists praised their dignity and commitment to Scottish traditions. Catherine found herself scrutinized for everything from her choice to wear tartan to her pronunciation of Scottish place names. The most emotionally challenging aspect of their early reign was explaining the changes to their children. Prince George, at 10 years old, was beginning to understand that his father's new role as king meant his own life would be fundamentally different. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were younger but still confused by the increased security, media attention, and formal protocols that now surrounded their family. Catherine spent hours talking with the children about their grandfather Charles's health, their father's new responsibilities, and what it meant for their family's future. The conversations were heartbreaking in their complexity. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that his childhood has effectively ended, that he is now second in line to the throne, and will spend the rest of his life preparing for a job he never chose? "Mummy," George asked one evening as Catherine tucked him into bed, "does this mean I have to be king someday too?" Catherine held her son close, feeling the weight of his question and the impossible burden it represented. "Someday, yes," she said gently, "but not for a very, very long time. And when that day comes, Papa and I will have taught you everything you need to know, just like Grandpa taught Papa." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Catherine's life. She tried to help George understand the honor and responsibility of royal service while also acknowledging his right to feel overwhelmed and even frightened by the prospect. She promised him that they would face whatever came together as a family, just as she and William were learning to face their new roles together. The children's adjustment to their new life became a constant concern. They were now the children of the king and queen, with all the security requirements and public interest that entailed. Their schools needed additional security measures, their friendships were scrutinized for appropriateness, and their every public appearance was photographed and analyzed. Catherine worked closely with child psychologists and education experts to help her children navigate their new reality while maintaining as much normalcy as possible. The balance between royal duty and family life had always been challenging, but now it was even more complex and demanding. The most touching moment came during their first family appearance as the new royal family. They attended the annual Royal British Legion Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall, where William laid a wreath as king for the first time. Catherine watched from the royal box with the children, explaining the significance of the ceremony and their family's role in honoring those who had served their country. When the hymn, "Abide with Me," was sung, Catherine saw William's shoulders shake slightly with emotion. This was the same hymn that had been sung at his mother's funeral, and the weight of representing the crown in such solemn circumstances was clearly overwhelming. But he maintained his composure, understanding that his personal grief and uncertainty had to remain private while his public role demanded strength and dignity. After the ceremony, they returned to Windsor Castle for a quiet family dinner, a rare moment of normalcy in their transformed lives. The children chattered about school and friends, while Catherine and William tried to process the magnitude of what they had experienced. In just a few weeks, they had gone from being senior working royals to being the king and queen of the United Kingdom, responsible for constitutional stability, international relations, and the future of an institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. "Are we doing this right?" William asked Catherine as they walked through the castle corridors after putting the children to bed. Catherine took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're learning," she said. "Every day, we're learning. And I think that's all anyone can ask of us right now." The question of whether they were doing it right would define their entire reign. There was no manual for becoming king and queen under these circumstances, no precedent for the challenges they faced. They could only trust in their love for each other, their commitment to service, and their hope that they were strong enough to carry the crown with the dignity and grace it demanded. The morning of the coronation dawned gray and drizzling, but by the time Catherine and William left Buckingham Palace for Westminster Abbey, London streets were packed with people from around the world who had come to witness history. 6 months had passed since King Charles's abdication, and the constitutional crisis that had threatened to destabilize the monarchy had been transformed into a celebration of renewal and continuity. Catherine sat beside William in the gold state coach, wearing the diamond diadem and a gown of ivory silk that had been embroidered with roses, thistles, shamrocks, and leeks representing the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. She had insisted that the Commonwealth nations be represented as well, with subtle embroidered symbols for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others worked into the intricate design. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. In less than 2 hours, she would kneel before the Archbishop of Canterbury and be anointed as Queen Consort, accepting a role that would define the rest of her life. The little girl who had grown up in a middle-class family in Berkshire was about to become one of the most recognizable women in the world, responsible for supporting her husband while finding her own way to serve the British people. The crowds lining the mall were enormous, despite the uncertain weather. People had camped overnight to secure the best viewing positions, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Catherine could see Union Jacks mixed with flags from Commonwealth nations, handmade signs expressing support for the new king and queen, and faces that reflected both excitement and curiosity about this young couple who had been thrust into roles they had expected to assume decades later. William reached for her hand as the coach turned into Parliament Square. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Catherine squeezed his fingers, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed his nerves despite his outward calm. "Together," she replied, the single word that had become their private mantra during the challenging months since Charles's abdication. The transformation of Westminster Abbey for the coronation was breathtaking. 2,000 guests had assembled in the ancient church where monarchs had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. The front rows were filled with heads of state, Commonwealth prime ministers, and members of European royal families, while the broader congregation included representatives from every aspect of British life: charity workers, military veterans, teachers, nurses, and ordinary citizens who had been chosen to represent the nation. Catherine's parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, sat in a place of honor near the front of the abbey, still adjusting to the surreal reality that their daughter was about to become queen. The sight of them gave Catherine strength, a reminder of the values and love that had shaped her, grounding her in the face of the overwhelming ceremony ahead. The service began with William's coronation, following traditions that dated back centuries, but adapted for the modern age. When Archbishop Welby asked if the congregation would support King William as their sovereign, the response thundered through the abbey: "God save King William." Catherine felt the power of that moment, the collective voice of a nation accepting her husband as their king. When William was anointed with holy oil behind a screen of silk, Catherine thought about the profound symbolism of the moment. The anointing was the most sacred part of the ceremony, transforming a man into a king through divine blessing. She watched as the screen was removed and her husband emerged wearing the golden robe of state, looking every inch the monarch he had become. The placing of St. Edward's crown on William's head was the moment that made his kingship official and complete. Catherine saw him close his eyes briefly as the weight of the crown settled on his brow, and she knew he was thinking of his mother, his grandmother, and all the monarchs who had worn that crown before him. When he opened his eyes and looked at her, she saw not just her husband, but her king, and the transformation was both thrilling and heartbreaking. Her own coronation began immediately after William's was complete. As she approached the altar, Catherine thought about the millions of people watching around the world, the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, and the impossible task of living up to the expectations placed on her. But she also thought about the food bank family she had met, the children she hoped to help through her charitable work, and the difference she might be able to make as queen. The anointing ceremony for Catherine was deeply moving. As Archbishop Welby anointed her with the same holy oil used to crown her husband, she felt a profound sense of responsibility settling over her. This wasn't just a ceremonial role. She was accepting a sacred trust to serve the British people for the rest of her life, to support her husband's reign while finding her own way to make a meaningful contribution to the nation. When the Queen Mary's crown was placed on her head, Catherine felt the weight of all the queens who had come before her. The crown had been worn by Queen Mary, the Queen Mother, and most recently by Queen Camilla at Charles's coronation. Now it was hers, and with it came the responsibility to honor the legacy of royal service while adapting to the needs of a new generation. The moment when William and Catherine, now crowned as king and queen, turned to face the congregation was electric. 2,000 people rose to their feet, and the abbey rang with "God Save the King," followed by "Long Live the Queen." Catherine felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked out at the faces before her, some familiar, many unknown, but all united in this moment of national celebration. The procession back to Buckingham Palace was a triumph. The rain had stopped, and London streets were filled with cheering crowds estimated at over 1 million people. Catherine and William rode in the gold state coach, now wearing their crowns and full coronation regalia, waving to the crowds who had waited hours to see them pass. The sight of their children on the balcony at Buckingham Palace was perhaps the most touching moment of the day. Prince George stood between his parents wearing the formal uniform of a page, while Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis flanked them in their coronation finery. The image of the new royal family together, crowns on the heads of their parents while the children waved to the crowds below, would become one of the defining photographs of the 21st century. The balcony appearance was carefully choreographed, but genuinely emotional. Catherine watched William interact with their children, pointing out details in the crowd below and explaining the significance of the moment. She could see him making an effort to help them understand that this was history they were participating in, not just a family celebration. The crowds in the mall were enormous, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sound of their cheers was overwhelming, a wall of celebration that seemed to shake the palace itself. Catherine waved to the people below, trying to make eye contact with as many individuals as possible, understanding that for many of them, this moment would be a memory they would treasure for the rest of their lives. The evening reception at Buckingham Palace brought together world leaders, Commonwealth representatives, and dignitaries from across the British establishment. Catherine, now wearing a different tiara and an elegant evening gown, found herself in conversations that highlighted the global significance of the day's events. President Biden spoke with her about the importance of the Anglo-American relationship during uncertain times. Chancellor Scholz of Germany discussed European cooperation and the role of stable democratic institutions. Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada expressed hope that the new reign would strengthen Commonwealth ties while respecting each nation's sovereignty. But it was the conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine that most moved Catherine. The Ukrainian leader, who had attended the coronation despite the ongoing war in his country, spoke about the importance of democratic values and strong alliances during times of global crisis. "Your Majesty," Zelensky said, "the world needs strong institutions and principled leadership. What you and the king represent, continuity, stability, service to something greater than oneself. These values matter more now than ever." Catherine was struck by the weight of what he was saying. The monarchy she and William now led was seen by many as a symbol of democratic stability and peaceful transition of power. Their success or failure would be watched by people facing much greater challenges around the world. The private family celebration that evening was smaller, but no less meaningful. Charles, still recovering but determined to attend his son's coronation, raised a toast to the new king and queen. His presence at the ceremony had been deeply moving for William, a sign that despite the unusual circumstances of his abdication, father and son remained united in their commitment to the crown. "To William and Catherine," Charles said, his voice still weak but filled with pride, "may your reign be long, wise, and blessed with the love of the people you serve." Catherine felt the full weight of what they had accomplished settling on her shoulders. 6 months earlier, she had been awakened by a phone call that changed everything. Today, she had been crowned Queen of the United Kingdom and 15 other Commonwealth realms, accepting a responsibility that would shape every day of the rest of her life. The children were exhausted, but excited, chattering about the day's events as Catherine and William tucked them into bed. George asked thoughtful questions about the coronation ceremony, while Charlotte wanted to know when she could wear a tiara like Mummy. Louis, barely old enough to understand what had happened, mostly wanted to know if they could do it again tomorrow. After the children were asleep, Catherine and William sat together in their private sitting room, still wearing their evening clothes, but, finally, alone for the first time since dawn. The crown sat on a nearby table, catching the lamplight and serving as a constant reminder of what they had become. "How do you feel?" William asked, echoing the question Catherine had asked him on their first night as king and queen. Catherine considered the question carefully. Different, she said finally. This morning I was Catherine, Princess of Wales, looking forward to becoming queen someday. Tonight I am Queen Catherine, and that change feels complete. Like something that was always going to happen has finally happened. William nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The coronation had transformed them in ways that went beyond mere ceremony. They were no longer preparing for their roles. They were living them, and would continue to live them for the rest of their lives. The challenges ahead were enormous. The Commonwealth was changing, with some nations questioning their relationship with the crown. Economic uncertainty continued to affect millions of British families. Constitutional questions about the monarchy's role in modern democracy remained unresolved. International tensions required careful diplomatic navigation. But Catherine felt ready for those challenges in a way she hadn't 6 months earlier. The crisis that had brought them to the throne had also prepared them for it, testing their resilience and forcing them to discover strengths they hadn't known they possessed. As they finally prepared for bed, Catherine caught sight of herself in the mirror once more. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had stood in this room 6 months earlier. Not in appearance. The physical changes were minimal, but in presence, in confidence, in the quiet authority that came from accepting responsibility and discovering she could carry it. Your Majesty, William said softly, using the formal title playfully as he had when they were younger, and the idea of kingship seemed like a distant dream. Your Majesty, Catherine replied, taking his hand as they had every night since their marriage. Royal protocol be damned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to serve. But tonight, they were simply William and Catherine, husband and wife, king and queen, facing an uncertain future together with love, determination, and the knowledge that they had been tested by crisis and had not been found wanting. The reign of King William V and Queen Catherine had begun not with celebration but with constitutional crisis, not with anticipation but with shock and grief. But it had survived those early challenges and emerged stronger, more purposeful, and more determined than anyone, perhaps including themselves, had dared to hope. The little girl from Berkshire who had fallen in love with a prince at university had become Queen of England, not through fairy tale romance, but through dedication, service, and the kind of quiet strength that only emerges when tested by impossible circumstances. And, in becoming queen, Catherine had discovered not just what she owed to her country, but what her country owed to itself. The promise that even in the darkest moments, renewal was possible, that continuity and change could coexist, and that love really could conquer all. The crown had found its new bearers, and they had proven themselves worthy of it.